This is a recording for the CUPHAT project. My name is Chris McCann and here with me is Matt O'Brien. Today is the 23rd of June 2023 and I have with me here Helen Lawless. Thank you, Helen. Can you confirm for the recorder that you are happy to take part in this project?
Yes, I am.
Great. And could you spell your name for the recorder, please?
Yes, it's Helen Lawless.
Excellent. Thank you. So we'll start very broadly with your early life. So perhaps if you could tell us when and where you were born and what your earliest memories are.
Okay, in some ways these might be quite fitting for the CUPHAT project because I was born in County Wexford and grew up in the foothills of the Blackstairs Mountains. So some of my earliest memories would actually be looking out at Mount Leinster, which was what we saw when we opened the kitchen door every day.
And were the mountains part of your life? Did you spend a lot of time in them?
At that point in time, I didn't spend a lot of time in the mountains. I lived on a farm and like most small mixed farms, children in the household were expected to do their bit as well. But the mountains did have, I suppose there was a particular connection there because my father had actually worked on Mount Leinster when they were building the mast on the summit of Mount Leinster, and we did a couple of times have trips up there as children as well. He knew the man the radio operator, I think, who was based on the summit at that time, and we seemed to be able to know which Sunday afternoons you could arrive at the road up Mount Leinster and get through without having to walk up. So yes, I'd say the first mountain that I got to the summit of, I actually drove to the top. It was Mount Leinster. Well, I didn't drive, I was in the back seat, but so my early mountain experiences were a little different to what I enjoy today.
And what about your early school experiences? Where did you go to school and how was that?
I went to national school in a place called Came, and Came in Irish means a step, and we were always told that the origin of the name Came meant that it was a step up towards the mountains. And the other side, we lived between Came, Kilteely and Killaan, if you like, and Kilteely, which is only 3 miles from where I grew up, is pretty much on the edge or in the Blackstairs Mountains. So yeah, we would have driven through those mountains regularly. We used to bring pigs for sale in Borris, so that went through Ballymurphy to get there. We drove through the Scullow Gap, so we were in and out of the mountains. My mother was from South Wexford, so if we were visiting her family, we would have driven down by Templeludigan, Ballywilliam. So I think it is that way for many people, even if you don't grow up in the mountains. They are very large visible features in our landscape, and they frame our lives, and mountains form part of our identity. If you're from a place where mountains are a dominant feature in the landscape, they are part of your psyche from the get-go.
You mentioned the villages of Kilteely, Killaan there. What were those villages like when you were growing up?
Kilteely was probably more vibrant than it is today. Certainly one of my childhood memories was going into Cushan's shop and getting sweets. I don't think the shop is there anymore, but Bowes still have, I think, the 2 pubs opposite sides of the road there. We would also have My father had relatives buried in the graveyard in Kilteely, so we would have attended the annual pattern in the cemetery in Kilteely. That was, part of one of our summer evenings or summer Sundays, depending on what way it fell. We went to field days in those surrounding villages as well. Would have had field days in our own community in Came, and Sunday entertainment for the kids was to go to events like that, buy tickets to watch white mice going in and out of doors, see if you could win something on the bottle stall, or get a ride on a donkey or a pony, that kind of thing. Great community events. Yeah.
What would happen at the pattern?
Um, each family would stand beside the graves of their departed family members, and there's mass, and then afterwards, of course, there's that natural mixing as people catch up with, like we wouldn't have gone to mass in Kilteely, so we wouldn't, while we're part of the same parish. Kilteely came and Ballindagan form one parish, the parish of Ballindagan. So we would have, you'd see people that you wouldn't see all that regularly at the pattern. Always a bit of a chat afterwards, unless the midges were biting on that particular evening, in which case people would scatter a little quicker. And my great-grandfather is buried in Killaan, and we would also have attended the pattern in Killaan every year. Same story with the midges, slightly damper ground, but that... while I grew up actually closer to Killaan than to Came, but Killaan didn't have a Catholic school or church. The graveyard must have been interdenominational, but that was one of the things we would have done around Killaan. Other things, Rackards Pub would have been my father's regular. It was active in the time. There was a shop in Killaan when I was a child. Again, somewhere we went for sweets. When I was a younger child, we didn't even have a phone, so our local public phone box was in the village of Killaan. And I suppose when you think about things like that, you realise that even though I'm in my mid-50s, but it was quite different when 50 years ago, when I was a child. Our lives tended to operate within a much smaller radius than they do today. We would have, gone to shops that were within 2 miles of us. In national school, of course, we were going to a school that was just over 2 miles away. The social activities you were involved in tend to happen within that close radius as well. Looking around where I live now in Wicklow, you can see that everybody's lives happen across a much wider scale. People are working in Dublin, their children may be in childcare somewhere between here and Dublin. Even some of the children locally may not go to the nearest national school. They may go somewhere that's close to their grandparents or on their parents' way to work. Secondary schools, obviously, we all scatter a little more widely for that anyway. But I think we have seen a hollowing out of those rural villages. The village nearest where we live here in Rathdangan in the 1980s had 3 pubs and a shop, post office. Now we have no pub. Our last surviving pub in the village closed just before COVID and hasn't reopened since. And that really does affect the activity and the vitality of a community. I think it also affects the sense of identity. If a village has no pub, no shop, and in Rathdangan's case, the post office, the school and the church are both roughly 1 kilometre from the centre of the village. So it's difficult to maintain a sense of identity when people passing through would consider the place to be little more than a crossroads.
It's very interesting. We might come back to that point a little bit later when we're sort of addressing maybe some of the themes of CUPHAT. For now, though, I think maybe perhaps if we can then, and you mentioned the secondary schools, what about your own secondary school and where did you go?
I went to secondary school in Enniscorthy, Colostabreed, or the Mercy Convent, just below Vinegar Hill. So again, hills and mountains seem to be a feature in my life throughout. And I was there for 5 years. Like a lot of people from a rural area going to secondary school in the town, I got a bus to the school each day. Not sure what else to say about that. I think it was an enjoyable experience. There was lots of growing up done in that time. I think for somebody who's gone to a small national school, moving into a secondary school that at that time had 700 pupils, you go from being a biggish fish in a small pond to being small fish in a big pond. But at the same time, I think I was probably ready for that as well. It was good.
And then post-secondary school, what did you do after you left secondary school?
I, like lots of people, I moved to Dublin, went to college, studied advertising. After that, moved into working in the advertising and design business, which I did for about 15 years. And from there moved, quite a jump really, to working for Mountaineering Ireland, the representative body for hill walkers and climbers, as their first full-time employee in 2001. There had been a couple of part-time people there before that. That might appear to be a big sideways jump, but hill walking had been my hobby for many years before that, and I was a member of Mountaineering Ireland, indeed a volunteer within Mountaineering Ireland. So when the job opportunity arose, and I wasn't actually looking for a job, my partner suggested that perhaps I should apply, and I did, and to my surprise I was offered the job, and decided these things happen for a reason. I accepted and certainly have no regrets.
That's very interesting. You talk about the you being the first full-time employee. I will come back to that, but perhaps if you could just tell us then about how you developed that love, that interest of hill walking and mountaineering.
Yeah, that most definitely comes from growing up in the country, and as a child, while I was working on the farm quite a bit, I also had time to explore my surroundings, and I enjoyed doing so. I guess lots of families have traditions around Christmas time, but one of the ones I recall is that my father, who was a typical farmer, busy farming, if he wasn't farming at a mart, at a hurling match or a funeral, or in the pub, that was about it really, or bingo. But one of the things we did before Christmas each year was we'd take a walk around not just our fields but surrounding farms on a hunt for buried holly, and that would involve crossing ditches and walking through bogs and in the pursuit of red berries. I really enjoyed that, and having done that at a young age, traipsing behind my father, as I got a little bit older, I realised I liked doing that myself. So I'd go out and have a wander around and go and sit by a stream or look for frog spawn and frogs in a pond, go down to the river. So with that enjoyment of nature was, I suppose, embedded from an early age, and that that is what led me to the outdoors. I think when you're in the place, you don't always appreciate it. I grew up with it, but it was only when I moved to Dublin and I was for the first time in an urban environment that I realised there was something missing. And I was fortunate when I first moved to Dublin. I lived on Leinster Road in Rathmines, and at that time anyway, the 47B bus used to go up Leinster Road, and it had Rockbrook written on the front of it. And I was curious about where this Rockbrook place was. It sounded interesting. So I took the 47B bus one weekend and found myself up in the Dublin mountains, and things went from there. Mm-hmm.
Was there the kind of organised hill walking mountaineering in say the 80s, even the 90s as there is now?
There was. I wasn't. I suppose initially I went by myself, or I went with a guy I was in college with, and we'd just go for a wander. We really didn't have much of a clue. I was probably the sort of person that I might frown upon now, but then I remember that everybody started somewhere, and I started, with a tiny bag and a few bits in it. I didn't have a map. I hadn't even ever seen one at the beginning, and well, actually that's not true, but I just didn't have a proper map for the mountains. I gradually I built up some level of knowledge, and I did have a map then, and I had a rudimentary compass as well that told me whether I was going north, south, east or west. And I used to ring a friend of mine on a Saturday evening if I was going walking, and I'd tell her where I was going to go. And at this point, of course, I had established all the various bits of the Dublin bus network that pointed into the mountains and took advantage of them all. Many of those services I think would no longer be available, but I used to ring her on a Saturday evening and say, look, if I don't ring you by 9-10 o'clock tomorrow night, you should do something. And eventually she said, look, I think this might be better if you joined a club or something. So I did have a brief spell in before I joined a club in Dublin. I had a brief spell in college in Coleraine as well, and I joined the mountaineering club in the University of Ulster, Coleraine, and had my first rock climbing experiences there on the north coast and some hill walking experiences in the Glens of Antrim and in the Sperrins. And then when I came back to live in Dublin, I briefly went out with UCD Mountaineering Club for a while, and then I joined in 1989 a Dublin-based club called the Bootleggers Hill Walking Club, and I'm still a member.
That's great. Then to return back to the Mountaineering Ireland job, so this is 2001, is that right?
Yes.
So in 2001 you were the first full-time employee. What was the why was that role created, and what was the kind of outlook then of Mountaineering Ireland at that time? Why?
The title of the job was Development Officer. It was a broad-ranging role supporting the executive committee, as it was called then, the board of directors now, supporting our clubs. I'm not sure how many clubs we had at that time. We had about 4,000 members, I think, or 3,000 to 4,000 members. So the number of clubs had built up considerably. So providing advice to clubs, especially new clubs that were being formed. Also supporting our training committee, which developed and administered training schemes for hill walkers and climbers. And those schemes would have been established from the 1970s onwards. The most popular training scheme for hill walkers, the Mountain Skills Programme, was introduced in the early 1990s. So we were actively encouraging people who were out enjoying the hills to develop their skills personally and for leadership. And you had asked earlier about how many clubs there were when they were established. Mountaineering Ireland was first established as the Federation of Mountaineering Clubs in Ireland in 1971, and at that time there were 7 clubs affiliated when the organisation was first established. There were probably 1 or 2 others about that didn't join, at least initially. So I think at this point you could say the club scene really consolidated in the early 1970s, 50 years ago, and continues to grow. At this point, Mountaineering Ireland has 190 affiliated clubs across the island of Ireland. We're an all-island body.
You mentioned that when you were living up in Dublin that something felt missing about not being in the mountains. So when did you move back down into Wicklow, and what was that move like? I moved to Wicklow in 2005, and it was actually really wonderful. Myself and my partner moved here in September 2005, and when your first evening is just about trying to get boxes out of the van, and the hired van, and doing what you need to do to sleep in the place your first night. Actually, we had a bat in the house on the first night, which we were thrilled with. And haven't seen one since, but that the house hadn't been occupied for a couple of years. But the next day we straightened our backs by taking a walk along the road locally, and I remember turning around to Mairead and saying, I feel really at home here, like we've been here forever. And she said, yeah, I feel exactly the same. We'd both grown up in a rural area, both grew up on farms, so the farmland that surrounds us and the hills that are above, it's the kind of landscape that we do feel most at home in. And I think
moving into the Rathdangan area, like, we didn't become immersed in the community immediately. I suppose we were conscious of being brand new in the area, but when we did put feelers out, there was a warm welcome. In fact, even before we put any feelers out, we were welcomed into the area by a local woman, Kathleen Cullen, who I think was famous for calling around to people, finding out where they were from and what skills they might have to contribute to the community. The community in Rathdangan has, partly through proximity to Dublin, for a long time there have been people coming here to the hills, maybe having a mobile home or a holiday home in the area. And there's been definitely an easiness in this area with people coming in, if you like, from outside. One of the other factors in that is that the current St. Patrick's Missionary Society facility in High Park, which is now a retirement home for missionary priests, in the 1980s was a seminary where priests were trained, and all of those priests would have come down to Rathdangan and supported one of those 3-ish pubs, depending at one point there was 4 pubs, then there was 3, then there was 2, and latterly 1. But so the community in Rathdangan has always had people who've come from outside, and they've in my experience they've been welcomed. We were certainly welcomed, and we could tell that they were used to blow-ins around here.
If you could describe it in sort of condensed sort of what's the word I'm looking for? If you could describe the community spirit in Rathdangan, how would you describe it?
I would say it's very strong. It's still strong today. There's a lot of very quiet, capable people in Rathdangan who would most certainly look out for you. Nobody be left stuck. Nobody be in trouble. And I think that it's a spirit that you find a lot in upland communities, because upland communities are, physically maybe remote from other services and supports. And certainly in places like this, we're in the hills just under Lugnaquilla, we still get snowed in at times. But I remember speaking with a man who lived in this house in the 1980s, and he said that he was twice snowed in for a month. So that sort of thing fosters resilience within people, but also that camaraderie, that people work together. When we did get snowed in, if somebody with a big 4-wheel drive was going into Baltinglass, they'd send around a message just to see if anybody needed anything. That kind of thing is still strong here.
It had obviously been 15 years, I believe that's correct, since you'd been in Dublin for 15 years, would that be right?
18. Oh, was I in Dublin for 15 years? Yes, I was, yeah.
So a fair amount of time. Did your kind of perception of the mountain uplands, had you noticed any change, or was there still the same feeling about being in the mountains given that long time before you moved back after living?
I suppose I was moving back into a different place, even though it felt familiar and felt similar to where I'd grown up. There would, where we live here, it would have been different in that there was less arable agriculture than there was. I was on the margins, if you like, just below the hill land. So grew up in a setting where there was more arable farming, more cereals grown, for example, than there is around here. In the hills themselves, I think I probably wasn't attuned enough to discern differences in the hills here compared to what I had grown up with. Life in general was probably a bit, everything was faster. Tractors were bigger. Agriculture had become more mechanized. There are lots of things that have changed life in and around the hills and continue. We're hopefully we're on the throes of change now. Hopefully we can embrace it.
I might throw all the way back. You mentioned what some of your early memories of hill climbing with your father and searching for holly. Were there any other plants or anything that you would look out for when you were on those walks?
I think my mother was probably the one who would have noticed nature even more than my father, and there's certainly things that I would associate with her. She loved the smell of woodbine or honeysuckle, which is in flower right now, and even on a warm evening this week, I was thinking of walking under honeysuckle as a child and that wonderful fragrance. I do also remember growing, and actually one of the things that has changed very much in agriculture, we grew up with a farmyard where we would have had pigs in houses and cows in a house, and we on a daily basis it took out the dung from behind the animals with a sprong, piled it up outside the houses. And I'm mentioning that detail for a particular reason, because one of my regular, it wasn't a one-off experiences as a child, was watching yellowhammers flock in a hawthorn tree in the yard, and I would have seen upwards of 20 yellowhammers together in a tree. That bird is rare now, not a bird that I've ever seen around this area. Occasionally I would see one down around where I grew up, but they're not there in the numbers that they were at that time. I think part of what encouraged them, they're seed eaters, and they would have picked seeds out from the dung piles. Those dung piles aren't there anymore. We joined the EEC and we had to get better about how we managed all our farm waste. But on one level, that all of that modernisation within agriculture did change our landscape, and we saw ditches removed to make fields bigger, and land reseeded, probably with a monoculture of perennial ryegrass, to be more productive than the mixed meadows that we would have had before. Certainly as a child, I vividly remember lying out in the field outside the house, making little tunnels in it before the hay would get cut. But there were buttercups and daisies and flowers like that you don't see in a lot of the grass fields that comprise our farms today. So we've definitely squeezed nature out, and I distinctly remember all of the little wet corners in fields where you might find frog spawn. You knew where to go and look with your jam jar, and most of those corners disappeared, many of them while I was even before I left home at the age of 18. Many of those were gone, and more of them disappeared subsequently as fields were enlarged and improved. And it's no reflection on individual farmers. It was the thrust of agricultural policy at that time, post EEC or latterly EC. But I think now we can see that with all of our progress that we lost things as well.
What do you think needs to change?
I think certainly in an upland environment, that we recognise the strengths of upland landscapes, and that we manage the land to those strengths, and we can't expect farmers to manage land differently unless we encourage them to do so. And if you talk to, and you probably have spoken with, hill farmers as part of this project, you probably won't find very many of them that have a successor willing to take on that kind of work. And we have to ask, is grazing for sheep, and sheep on the hills usually aren't even finished on the hills. They have to be sold on or brought to lower ground to fatten them up before they go to market. Is that the best that we can get from our hills? And I don't think it is. I think Ireland's uplands have the potential, and to some extent they already do, provide great benefit to society, but they have, if we if we play to the natural strengths of the hills, they have the potential to contribute a huge amount to society, quality of life. And it does mean a reorientation of farm payment schemes where farmers are not producing sheep. The sheep may still be there, but think of the sheep perhaps as being a tool to get grazing levels right that allow a greater diversity of plant species to grow, that where we try and get a cover of vegetation back, maybe on areas that have been too heavily grazed or where we've got bare peat, that we look after our peatlands better, because we've got lots of carbon in our peat soils, and Wicklow has a good deal of blanket bog, but quite a lot of it in poor condition. Thankfully, we're starting to see some projects now to look at restoring the damaged blanket bogs, and it's trying to restore a functioning ecosystem is not easy, and there isn't a textbook. There are loads and loads of videos and things to tell you how to get more grass off your land, but upland environments are complex, and but we do need to get on with it. There are tried and tested techniques, even if they haven't been done here, that we can apply, learn from, adapt as necessary. And those sort of benefits that a healthier upland environment can provide to society include carbon storage, enhanced biodiversity by having a more diverse habitat in the uplands, improved water quality. Most of Ireland's water supply has its origin in mountain rivers and streams. If the environment that the rain flows over, if the water that's coming from underneath the ground is coming from a healthier environment, water treatment costs will reduce. Mountains certainly, are not just defining features in people's landscapes and part of our identity. They're really also the cornerstone of our tourism product. Look at the imagery used by Fáilte Ireland or by Wicklow County Tourism or any other tourism authority. They gravitate towards those environments that are as natural as possible, our hills and coastlands. So there is, I think, a moral responsibility to not just take all of those things from the mountains, but to redirect funding back into those places to enable the uplands to deliver all of the benefits or ecosystem services they can provide for society.
Yeah, fascinating. And you, in that, you actually used the word identity, sort of upland identity. How would you describe the upland identity, if there is one?
Some of it, I think, goes back to that resilience that comes from living in a remote location, but there's also a spirit of independence linked with that, and that's strong in Wicklow. I wasn't long living in Wicklow before it was pointed out to me that Wicklow was the last county in Ireland to be shired, and there's reasons for that, Yeah, I think other than that, upland identity, there's a hardiness to people in the uplands as well. They don't have all of the services that others have never had as much comfort as others have, but there's that resilience, independence, hardiness, but there's a positivity too. I think a lot of the people around here love where they live and they're proud of it. And Lugnaquilla is, you stand in the village of Ratdangan, you look towards Lugnaquilla, people do feel an affinity with the mountains, even though some of those people may never have climbed to the summit of Lugnaquilla, but it's their mountain.
Not every mountain range is the same. They're sort of similar. And you mentioned earlier even being up in the Glens of Antrim and being up on the north coast. Specifically with the Black Stairs and Wicklow in mind, what are maybe some of the similarities and differences between the Black Stairs and Wicklow, because they're very close but also have the differences?
Yeah, the obvious similarity is in the general generally rounded character to both the Wicklow Mountains and the Black Stairs Mountains, and that comes very largely from their shared geology. They're part of the same mass of granite which runs from Dalkey in South Dublin right down to New Ross. It's one of the largest masses of granite in Western Europe, and the geology leads to the plants that grow there, and it does give them a similarity. Both mountain ranges have a good deal of peat as well. Looking at the differences, the Wicklow Mountains probably have more blanket bog, more wet heath. There's more dry heath habitat in the Black Stairs. The Wicklow Mountains is Ireland's largest continuous upland area. So when you stand on top of a mountain in Wicklow, you tend to be looking at other mountains around you. There's a real contrast then when you move to the Black Stairs, because the Black Stairs Mountains are by and large a ridge. And at any point along that ridge, when you stand on a summit and you look around you, you're looking down at quite fertile farmland in Wexford and in Carlow. So that's, a bit of the similarities and differences. And they're both wonderful.
I would certainly agree with that. Do you have favourite mountains start with Wicklow, do you have favourite mountains both to look at and admire and also to climb in Wicklow?
I think when I lived in Dublin, I had a real attachment to Mullaghcleavon, which is the second highest mountain in Wicklow. Gets its name from the feature on the northern side of the mountain, the corrie or cirque where Cleavon Loch sits, and Mullaghcleavon means the summit of the basket, and it describes that hollow where the lake sits. Having moved down here, undoubtedly the mountain that I have the biggest affinity with now would be Lugnaquilla, highest mountain in Wicklow, also the highest outside of County Kerry, actually. And I think some of that attachment just comes from spending a lot of time in a place that I've been fortunate enough to have time to explore Lugnaquilla from every angle, to see it in every season, to enjoy days there on my own and days with others. So there's a whole web of memories around the place as well.
And obviously the Black Stairs, you grew up there and spent so much time there. Would you have a favourite down there? I think probably Black Stairs Mountain itself, partly because where it is physically closer to where I grew up. It's a nice climb. It gets you to a good height, and you can see the Wexford and Carlow from there, and the Coolia Gap just down the far side of Black Stairs. There's a tradition of communities from the Carlow side and the Wexford side meeting there the end of July for Frock and Sunday, for dancing and drinking and all the rest. A celebration of the harvest, because the Frockin is known to be the first berry that ripens, so it signals the harvest, hence the long association with Frockins, and I suppose just celebration. I'm trying to remember, can't remember the name of the festival. Lunasa. Yeah. Did you? I've heard from other people that the tradition of Mountain Sunday sort of was dying out in the 70s. Was there any? Did you have anything like that when you were growing up? Did you go frockin' picking at the end of July? Anything like that?
We did. We picked frockins, but just locally. There may have been a Mountain Sunday celebration at that time. I'm actually not sure, but it wasn't one that we participated in. I do remember actually. It shows, I suppose, how as a young child we were going to get a dog, and my father said, we had to go up the mountain to get this dog, and normally whenever the car was going somewhere I wanted to go, but on this occasion I didn't want to go, and it was because I I had this fear that we were literally going to drive up the side of the mountain and the car might fall off. But when it was explained to me that that wouldn't happen, of course, I was straight in. I'd have to confess, on the occasion when we drove up one of those narrow lanes up the side of Blackstairs to acquire our new puppy, I was probably more interested in the puppy at the time.
Do you have any questions, Matt?
I suppose I'm just kind of interested from the tourist angle for the area as well. I mean, like you kind of noted earlier on, the proximity to Dublin. And I know we're obviously peak season now, probably for tourists coming to the area. Would that be fair?
Yeah, we're at the end of June. It'll be July, the end of next week. We are probably... In the Wicklow Mountains tend to be busiest as you come in towards the height of summer, towards July and August, when we typically expect to get warmer weather that draws people down from the hills again towards the beaches. So yes, we're at a busy time of the year in the Wicklow Mountains. In terms of visitors, yes, Wicklow would have more visitors, certainly from abroad, right, I'd say from Easter through to the end of September. There's a reasonably good spread because it is easy to get to, and a lot of people come to Wicklow not so much to stay, and that's a challenge for tourism in Wicklow, but they come as a day trip, as part of a trip to Dublin or the start of a trip elsewhere in Ireland. They fly into Dublin, they'll go to Glendalough, do a day in Wicklow, and then they might head west after that. So there are, where I live here in West Wicklow, we've got less visitors, I think, than, if you move across to Glenmalure, Glendalough, then you move further north in Dublin, in Wicklow, closer to Dublin, you've got more people as well. I think though when we think of tourism, we tend to, and certainly Fáilte Ireland tend to measure things in terms of bed nights and visitors, international visitors perhaps, but I think you've got to look at what the Wicklow Mountains are providing for the people who live here in Ireland, particularly those who live in the greater Dublin area, so Dublin and the surrounding counties. If they want an escape to nature, they want a mountain experience, a lot of those people are finding their way to Wicklow. So the Wicklow Mountains are providing huge sustenance for people that isn't, I think, readily recognised. And I think Wicklow, the entities involved in tourism in Wicklow end up carrying a load for surrounding counties that's not reflected in the funding that comes into Wicklow to make all of that tourism and visitor and recreation activity more sustainable.
The other question that just kind of came to mind is that you obviously have a history of working in advertising, and I was just thinking of how would you advertise this area? How would you advertise, again, just thinking about tourism, is there a way you could advertise this area to make it really attractive to people who are visiting?
I think I would focus on, I think heritage. The heritage story is really strong here in this part of Wicklow. We're not too far from the Baltinglass hill forts, for example, an amazing cluster of hill forts. We're only a few miles from the Dwyer McAllister cottage, which is packed with, the history of Michael Dwyer and that era. There's a huge amount around in terms of heritage, and also I think just trying to capture maybe the higher yielding visitor who is interested in a more immersive experience, a slower experience, one where they actually don't just land in, get their Insta picture and they're on again to somewhere else. Somebody who's prepared to make a little bit of effort and wants to get under the skin of a place and understand about it. I think that's probably a more fulfilling experience for visitors. It's probably more likely to result in them inspiring their friends and neighbours to come and visit this place, it's more likely to be respectful of the place and its natural environment. And fundamentally, it recognises the fact that our natural environment doesn't have an infinite capacity to support more and more people. And why do we do tourism? Countries, villages do tourism for income. And if you can have less people, less impact, and the same amount of income, and perhaps position your area or your product towards a more high-end market, I think that, and I think generally Irish tourism should probably go in that direction, because we're not a low-cost place to go for holiday. We're not a sunspot, yet people do love it here. So let's trade off the kind of experiences that we can give people. Part of that is local people telling their stories as well. Like, we're close to Kilranelagh graveyard here. Our local history group had an outing to Kilranelagh a few weeks ago. For people to get in there, walk through the gates of heaven, here, go up to Sam McAllister's grave, all of those things really enrich people's holiday experiences. We can make lots of good memories for people. We don't have to build anything new, bar perhaps a bit more accommodation here in West Wicklow might help. But we've got marvellous attractions around us. We just need to recognise the strength of what we've got and look after that for the future.
I might touch on the Kilranelagh graveyard. Actually, I have a personal interest in it. Could you perhaps tell us a bit about that graveyard and what's to be found there, and what the most interesting things are in the sort of complex?
It's a really old graveyard, arguably or possibly the oldest graveyard in Ireland. It's on the side of Kilranelagh Hill, so quite high up, probably broadly circular in shape. I mentioned the Gates of Heaven, two small standing stones there, but they are reputed to have been the end of an old road that led people to the cemetery, so they brought their dead through the Gates of Heaven. And there's various stories and fables about the wonderful things that happen when you go through the stones. I'm probably not the best person to tell the story of it, but there's also a holy well there that is believed to have a cure for warts. There is a railed grave that may or may not mark the site of where Sam McAllister was buried. Sam McAllister was the guy who took the hit at the Dwyer McAllister cottage to enable Michael Dwyer to escape out the back. There's a couple of old stone crosses there as well that are interesting. They're registered monuments, so it's a magical spot. It really is a lovely spot, and on the hill above is one of the hill forts I mentioned, part of the Baltinglass network of hill forts as well. So it's a place that speaks of deep history.
The growing up close to Killarney as well, was there any folklore associated with the well there?
We certainly we took holy water from the well, but I'm not sure exactly what it was meant to do for us. But there was an affinity with it, definitely, and it was. Beyond that, no, I can't say that I recall any particular folklore associated with the holy well. When I meet my sister tomorrow, she'll probably chide me for not remembering all the stuff that I should remember.
If a tourist was to come here and they'd been lured by the kind of the marketing sort of pitch, and you had to tell them to go to one place in this area, where would you tell them to go?
The easy answer would be Kilranelagh graveyard. I think after yesterday, after my comments a few moments ago, where else would you? I think the other place around here that again speaks of a lot of history is the Glenmalure Valley, and it's the most amazing U-shaped valley, a glacial trough, so the physical feature is amazing, but you've got, you've access to the hills there. You've got the Glenmalure Lodge, the pub, which ironically was built by a guy called Wiseman, and it was built at the time the military road was being built in Wicklow. So the very early 1800s, around the time the barracks was built there. So there's a ruined barracks there. It's a lovely welcoming spot, a place that where locals and visitors feel equally welcome. So I think a walk around that valley, up at the head of the Glenmalure Valley, there's a short walk that's been developed in the forest there that takes you past some of the ruins of the former mining buildings in the valley, including one that the local community campaigned to have, well, not restored, but protected, a crusher house that was a key building within the mines. So there's layers of history there. The Glenmalure Valley is famous as the only place in Ireland where we defeated the English in battle in 1592, I think, and we're still very proud of it.
And it's interesting that you do have that kind of connection with 1798, having lived in the two counties where it was most prominent. When you were growing up, was there much spoken of about 1798? Was there much of a kind of culture of...
Probably more I associate it more, funnily enough, with Enniscorthy than right where I grew up. I guess because of Vinegar Hill and having gone to school on the side of Vinegar Hill. So the memories were definitely strong. I think there was a real resurgence in the understanding and celebration, I suppose, or at least the acknowledgement of the 1798 rebellion after the 200-year anniversary in 1998. And there's a reenactment group that was formed. I think they were formed in Enniscorthy at that time, but they're still very active. And in fact, my brother-in-law's father and mother are part of that group. So yes, we can bring yeomen and so on here at a moment's notice if required. They've got all the costumes.
Matt, did you have anything else?
There was one thing earlier on, just you mentioned during your childhood, you at Christmas time, I think you were saying you toured the fields with your father. Was that kind of or was there a seasonal element to this? Did anything happen around Halloween or other kind of moments throughout the year? I'm trying to think if there was. I'm sure he went hunting rabbits at other times as well, and we were told they were chicken. I think I was probably a bit horrified the first time that I realised it was a rabbit that was in the pot. No, I mean there would have been other seasonal memories I would have, not necessarily more work related and recreational, like in around the Halloween break from school. We would have been picking potatoes. We grew potatoes, so that was the time when we gathered the potatoes, or the machine went along and tossed up the potatoes, and we went after filling baskets, buckets, boxes, whatever, with these potatoes that we sometimes then stored in a pit in the field. We sold them to shops in the town as well. So I think anybody growing up on a mixed farm, there was probably something that marked every season, or literally month to month. It was lambs in March. We grew strawberries, so the month of July was always picking strawberries. After that, you were probably thinning turnips. There was something going on all the time, and I think there was probably more variety in the work on a farm when it was a mixed farm and you had a little bit of everything than a whole lot of just one thing, which is more the way it is nowadays in farming.
I think you briefly touched on the reasons for that earlier, but when did that real change towards kind of monoculture and large herd farming, large flock farming begin?
I do think it began when we joined the EEC in 1973. I think that there was some of it starting to happen already, but there was definitely a step change at that point, and it had certainly, that obviously took place over a number of years, but by the time you got into, certainly by the time you got to the mid-1980s, farms in rural Wexford where I grew up had changed a lot. There was a lot less, there were fewer farms with hens and chickens and pigs, and there were more farms that had bigger fields and were doing just one or two things. Like even by the mid-1980s, there were probably less farmers growing turnips to give to animals for feed. They were just buying in, bags from the co-op. Certainly when I was a child, we grew our own field of barley. We stored our barley in the shed. We had a small machine that ground it, so we mixed up feed for our animals based on what we had grown on the farm. So there was a massive change in farming at that time. We bought a fertilizer spreader, so we were spreading artificial fertilizer. All of those changes happened in that period.
Did some of those changes in the short term bring maybe increased prosperity to some farms?
Yeah, I think they did. I think it's easy to forget. We're a wealthy country now. We weren't, I don't think, particularly wealthy before we joined the EEC, and it did scale and draining land, improving land. It did bring productivity, and people did see that as a good thing. We saw dairy farms being established, milking parlours popped up all around that time, and definitely being able to farm in that way increased income for farm families.
You spoke earlier a little bit quite fondly about your mother. Perhaps you could tell us a little bit more about her. We've heard a bit about your father and the farming. What did your mother sort of do, and what can you tell us about her?
My mother grew up in South Wexford, towards the younger end of a large family. So she trained as a nurse in Cornwall, and came back and nursed in New Ross and met my father, and then became a farmer's wife, looking after my grandfather, my father's father. And like lots of women on Irish farms, she had that caring role. She was cooking, cleaning, and initially when I was small there wasn't even a washing machine. There's a lot of hard work just in that part of it, but she did a huge amount of work out on the farm as well, and worked extremely hard, and was fantastic. I think when the benefit of hindsight, you realise how my father certainly worked hard as well, but my mother was never stopped from the time she got up till she went to bed. I think one of the things she did enjoy more was when you got to the winter and you had the dark evenings. There was a chance for her to sit down at the fire after you'd had your dinner. Well, it wasn't her dinner, of course, because we used to have our dinner in the middle of the day. Then we had our supper in the evening, and in the winter there was a little bit more time. I wouldn't even say it was for herself, but a bit more time maybe to be with her children than she would have had during the summer months. But she liked being outside too, and I think that's probably where I got it from as well. She enjoyed the outdoors. She liked the sun, and it's funny when my father died in 2005, and my mother would have been. They were sort of codependent towards the end because he had a lung condition called farmer's lung. So his mobility and quality of life had been affected. She was looking after him, but she was also in the early stages of memory loss and dementia. But as soon as he had passed away and she was relieved of this wifely role, we realised she loved travelling. And, even within a few days of his funeral, my sister was going to buy shoes for one of our kids and she was going to Waterford. My mother said, "Sure, I think I'll come with you." And we had forgotten. We had seen these photographs as we were growing up of, my mother on a Vespa in Rome, or my mother somewhere else abroad. She was 33 when she got married, so she'd had quite a bit of freedom. She'd lived abroad. She had taken European holidays when lots of people in Ireland weren't doing so, with her nursing friends, because they would have, I suppose, have been, at least they had an income. And yes, when after my father passed away, she did join my sisters on holiday abroad. She came up here to stay with us for a few days. She loved travelling, and I think that's where I got some of my love of travelling from as well.
Where do you like to travel?
Places with mountains. And in Ireland, certainly the west of Ireland, probably my go-to place would be South Mayo, Connemara, but it's not as if I have one place that I would always go to. Obviously love Kerry as well, because it's got so much mountain. Donegal is wild. Scotland is wonderful, loads of mountains. Wales, likewise. And further afield, certainly the Alps. We're going to the Alps on holiday shortly for 2 weeks, and I've been fortunate enough to get to some other mountains as well. One of the most outstanding places I've visited is Iceland, which just has an incredible landscape that looks like it was just made yesterday. It's really raw, full of colour, quite wild. There's lots of wonderful places to go. Though we are, conscious that in a time of climate crisis, it can't be jetting to New York to go shopping for a weekend. Not that I ever did, but trying to, get the most from travel. And I think it's just like anything else. If you're not having it every day, you appreciate it more. It becomes more special.
Just of all of the kind of maybe the mountains that you have climbed, has any maybe surprised you, or has any proved to be quite difficult?
I think the weather conditions really have a huge bearing on what you have to endure. And we've been lost up there on Lugnaquilla. Mairead and myself have got lost, even though we know the place like the back of our hands, in really thick fog. We've got stuck in deep snow up there. I think that's actually one of the things I really like about mountains. Every time you go, whether it's to an unfamiliar mountain or a familiar one, let's say the familiar ones, when you go back again and again, every day, different weather, different experience, different people. It's one of the great things about mountains. I despair slightly of people who say, I've done that mountain. I thought, yeah, but go back again. It'll be different. Different times of the year as well. Thankfully, I've not got into any serious bother, either at home or abroad. Yes, we've met challenges, but those difficult days give you a different kind of satisfaction. It may not be so much right at the time. It's the having survived afterwards, and having memories and stories that you'll share for the future.
I think we've sort of more or less covered a fair bit of ground. Is there anything that we haven't spoken about so far that you'd like to talk about?
God, I think that mountains are important, that we help people see how much mountains contribute to society, like all the people in Dublin or other urban locations that don't realise they have a connection with mountains. It's flowing through their tap, and we depend on mountains more than we realise. And as we face into climate crisis with more extreme rainfall events and longer droughts predicted, we really do need to look after our mountains in cooperation with the people who own and farm the land, to help build Ireland's resilience to the impact of climate change. Mountains most definitely are places of potential. They're also places for learning, where we can all go back to nature, understand what we've come from, learn a little bit about the plants that grow around us and the benefits that our ancestors gained from those and that we may gain in future. Maybe we'll gain different benefits from being in those places, but there's a tremendous amount to learn about, enjoy and appreciate in our mountains. And certainly part of what I do within Mountaineering Ireland is trying to encourage respectful and responsible enjoyment of Ireland's mountains, and to encourage the people who go to those places to be a voice for them as well. And we are increasingly seeing that people are recognising, I think particularly post-COVID as well, where a lot of people were shut off from nature for a long time, and they realised they needed it and appreciated it more when they got back to the outdoors, that it made it easier for people to see that there's a link between the quality of the environment itself, its richness and diversity, and the quality of the experience that people enjoy. Yes, there are people who just want to get to the top of the mountain and back down again, but most people are there for something more than that. The sights, sounds, smells of nature are part of what make their experience, make their memories, and soothe their soul.
I think on that note, perhaps I'll ask the last question that I ask of everyone we interview. It might take you a moment to think of it, but it also might come immediately to mind. If you could sum up what it means to you to live in the mountains and also be from the mountains from down the base, if you could sum up, what does it mean to you to be in the mountains?
Just about every single day we say we love where we live. It's definitely, it grounds us, it nourishes us, and it inspires us. It obviously keeps us active, which helps keep us fit and healthy. And we love we love being part of a mountain community. We enjoy the connections with our neighbours. We're proud to live in the mountains and to be part of this community here. Couldn't commend it highly enough. And the house next door is for sale, by the way, guys.
Well, thank you very much for spending this time with us, Helen. Hope you enjoyed the interview, and thank you.
I did. Look, thank you, and wish you all the best with the rest of the work on the CUPHAT project as well. And
thank you.
Thank you.